Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are on lesson 25, chapter 25, which is JavaScript best practices. What we're going to learn in this lesson is best practices for creating unobtrusive scripts. We're going to learn the importance of separating content, presentation, and behavior. We're going to learn the importance of following web standards to create cross-browser scripts. We're going to learn how to read and display browser information. We're going to learn how to use feature sensing to avoid errors. We're going to learn how to support older, less compliant browser versions, and how to support non-JavaScript browsers. So we're going to talk about some scripting best practices. These are guidelines for using JavaScript that people have learned over the years. And the benefits of this is our code will be a lot more readable and easy to maintain if we follow these best practices. We'll create code that follows these standards. It really won't be too much affected when newer browser versions are released. And we'll create pages that work even without JavaScript. It'll also be easy to adapt our code, and if we create it for one site, we can reuse it and create it for another site. Also, it'll be easier to use for a user and a lot easier to fix when things don't work by using these best practices. We want to avoid overusing JavaScript. This is a best practice because there's a lot of JavaScript stuff that can now be achieved in CSS. So even though both approaches are possible, CSS is usually preferable because it's well supported across multiple browsers. Also, a lot of users are using outdated, underpowered computers that might have slow and unreliable internet and older versions of web browsers. So unnecessary JavaScript code might slow down or make the site not work at all for them. We want to always remember to separate content, presentation, and behavior. Especially when you're creating a full entire site application, we need to deal with everything that we learned about separating content, presentation, and behavior. Content is the HTML, presentation is the CSS, and behavior is the JavaScript. It's a good idea to keep these three things in mind when creating larger sites, especially. JavaScript can also be a huge drain on the web page because it is downloaded all by itself. The browser cannot download anything else while the script is loading. So it's good to use an external JavaScript file and place the script tag last in the HTML. By doing this, you'll ensure that the entire page will render and be visible even as the script is still loading. We talked about progressive enhancement in a previous lesson. We talked about adding event handlers. There's more than one way to set up an event handler. The simplest way is to add them directly into an HTML tag. This method works, but it does not involve putting JavaScript code in the HTML page, which means you haven't fully separated content and behavior. So to keep things entirely separate, you can set up the event handler in JavaScript file instead. Your book goes through and then tells you how to attach events the cross-browser way, and then goes over some web standards to avoid being browser specific. We want to make sure we document our code. We want to use comments before any function that contains more than a few lines. We want to use inline comments whenever the code would otherwise be confusing. We want to use comments wherever the original author can pass on certain knowledge that some other person working on the code may not know. And we want to use comments as instructions for commonly used code modifications. It's always good to comment your code, write what you're doing, write what you're changing, and why. We want to make sure our code is always usable and accessible. And it's good if you write code following these best practices, you can always reuse code. If I do a function, a certain really good navigation menu, I can reuse that code again and then just actually style it differently. Or if I write a loop to loop through all these things and print out something that I need, if you're writing code following these best practices, you can reuse your code a lot of different times and style it differently. Your book then goes through in this chapter and talks about reading browser information and then also displaying browser information. Your book gives you an example of a script to display information about the browser. It talks about cross-browser scripting and feature sensing. So checking browser versions is sometimes called browser sensing. A better way of dealing with multiple browsers is called feature sensing. In feature sensing, rather than check for a specific browser, you can check for a specific feature. For example, suppose your script needs to use the document.getElementById function. You can begin a script with an if statement that checks for the existence of this function. So if document.getElementById, do this. If the function exists, the block of code between the brackets is executed. Another common way to use feature sensing is at the beginning of the function that makes use of the feature function change text. If it's not the case, document.getElementById, return, so the rest of the function executes if the feature is supported. So the getElementById is widely supported by all modern browsers. You need to set up feature sensing for it only if your scripts are breaking and you've investigated every other possibility. You don't need to check for every feature, so chances are if the getElementById is supported, chances are the rest of the W3C DOM functions are supported. The book then talks about supporting non-JavaScript enabled browsers. Most browsers include an option to turn off JavaScript. Some corporate firewalls and personal antivirus software blocks JavaScript. Some ad blocking software mistakenly prevents scripts from working even though there aren't ads. And then some older mobile phones support little to no JavaScript. So you can't assume that all users will have JavaScript. So 2 techniques you can use to make sure the users can still see your site are discussed in the following section. Using the no-script tag, keeping JavaScript optional, and creating unobtrusive scripting. You can create a script that adds functionality to a page with JavaScript without compromising its performance in older browsers. The book goes through an example of a graphic checkbox example, which it will display the JavaScript graphic text box, and if not, it will default to the HTML text box. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen with you and show you some of these examples so we can see for ourselves what is happening and how they work. Here's an example of using JavaScript to display browser information. Notice in our script tags, we have text plus equal, then we're actually putting our HTML code here with our list item tag strong, code name is the text that's going to appear as bold. And then we're concatenating navigator.appCodeName, version, agent, language, and platform, and then we're saying document.get element by ID, info, which is this ID of this unordered list tag that we created, .inner HTML equals text. So we're adding all these to that text. And if we save and load this, we'll see it contains the following information about the browser we're using. Code name, app name, version, user agent, language, and platform. Next example. This is displaying 2 different checkboxes. An ordinary checkbox that you can check, which is done in HTML, or a graphic checkbox. This is actually an image right here, and when I check it, this is actually another image. So if we look here in the JavaScript, this is how we're unobtrusive. Find the object and its parent. We're creating the image element and setting the onClick event. Save the checkbox ID with the image ID. Display the graphic checkbox. Now our function toggle, find the checkbox by removing image from the image ID. Click the checkbox. Display the right image for the clicked or unclicked state. So if the checkbox is clicked, it's displaying this image, which I have an image of this image right here. Else, when it's unchecked, it displays this image. So there's 2 different images that are done in this if-else statement. Depending on if it's clicked or not, we'll display a different image. We can make it so if this doesn't work, it can display an ordinary checkbox. Okay, I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 25 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.